This meeting is being recorded.
Oh man, she admitted it was being recorded. Darn it. I'm just kidding. Now, should all workloads go to the cloud? And what I mean about all workloads, I'm talking about those still in the data center and possibly a hybrid type approach. No, I don't believe all workloads will ever make it to the cloud. In fact, some will be either refactored, retired, or even retained in their current environment. But those that should go to the cloud should do a huge analysis and do a deep dive on their application and how it's communicating. Today, we're talking about not only a cloud first approach or strategy, but from a data center expert at Aspire Technologies. Joining me today for my 100, yes, my 100, sorry, Christian, I didn't tell you ahead of time, but I didn't want to spoil it, episode for the John Myer podcast. Please join me in welcoming Christian Chavez, Data Center Cloud Solutions Architect at Aspire Technology Partners. Christian, thank you so much for joining me.
John, I don't know what to say. Seriously, like this is a big surprise for me, and I think you did this on purpose because I had no idea. But thanks for thinking of me on this 100th episode. Seriously, this is awesome.
So when I was going through my list, I was like, man, I need to celebrate with my 100th with somebody who I haven't done it and that I can surprise them. So I thought of a number of folks and I was like, I want to make this about a topic and not about my 100th episode, but I wanted to kind of roll it all in together. So I appreciate you joining me for it.
I'm so I'm still trying to process that, dude. This is amazing. I mean, yeah, we worked in the past. I've been watching your videos. I've been following you, and what you've done lately, man, it's amazing. You're killing it, man. It's awesome.
I appreciate it. I'm glad you have liked, subscribed, and you're one of my followers. So I appreciate all the support. When it does get a little tough sometimes, it's nice to hear from my fans. Let's jump into it a little bit. Today, we're talking about cloud strategy and should all workloads go to the cloud? Now, Christian, real quick, let's give everybody a little backstory on what you came from, like data center background, and our story together.
Oh, yeah. So managed hosting, if you remember, right? Back in the day, managed hosting was huge. Dealing with mom and pop websites that were paying you, $6-12 a month. So managed hosting was essentially that back in the day before virtualization. And you and I, right, we lived through that world. We were back in support for those systems. So the 3 a.m. calls because somebody couldn't get their email out in California was brutal. And that was an account that was paying like $12 a month, right? So we were providing, I guess, you would say some top-notch class support for somebody who's paying $12 a month. So yeah, I mean, we cut our teeth in those days prior to virtualization. And I remember the data centers, which you and we've done a lot of work inside the data centers, right? Running cable, racking and stacking. Again, it was really just about leveraging a single server for multiple clients that were paying those, the low end per month. But still, they were valuable clients, right? I think you and I knew that back in the day because we saw some growth come out of there. But yeah, so it was awesome to cut our teeth through there. And then moving up to virtualization was kind of like the no-brainer, not only just for the management of servers, but the footprint that actually was growing inside of the data centers. I remember we were stamping out like data centers like crazy. But yeah, that's how you and I got started, right? So it's amazing where we've come from and where we are today with cloud, the way it is.
Christian, I remember when I first got hired I was building servers. So I was unboxing the actual case, installing everything, set up, installing the OS, racking, stacking. You would run the cable and be like, yo, Christian, my network's not working. Well, I didn't turn on the port. Oh, okay. Hey, did you ping the internal IP? Oh, okay. And man, I was learning things from the start, and we're talking about 20 years ago.
Yeah. It was amazing. Like I said, you coming in, you were doing the racking and stacking. In that time, I was in networking, right? So moving up, doing sysadmin. So coming up through the ranks, sysadmin, being on the back end, post installation, and then ultimately moving into pre-sales. Is really where I'm at now, but still the explosion that happened inside of it's just that organization itself that you and I work with inside of. And then to see you progress on top of it, because again, I was sysadmin, you were building servers, to where you are now, which is one of the reasons why I was like, wow, this is incredible for what you're doing in the tech space, right? And putting out some of the content that you're putting out. It's amazing to watch you kind of excel in that area.
Well, Christian, you've seen my growth and you've seen me progress over the years from starting from early on hardware to sysadmin to actually being in a lot of the IT services to cloud. Let's talk about cloud and strategy. You're in the data center. Actually, I like your title, Data Center Cloud Solutions Architect, which it's like, should I be on premise in the data center or should I be in the cloud? Let's understand what you're doing and talk about our topic of really should all workloads go to the cloud?
And that's key, right? So yes, data center cloud solutions architect for Aspire technology partners. But in this case, you're right. They both still exist, right? And I think there's a necessity for both. So whether you're on-prem, whether you have a strategy to move to cloud, I think both worlds still exist, and they kind of need to work together, right? We hear the multi-cloud conversations that are happening, hybrid cloud, and they still kind of carry an on-prem notion to them, because honestly, I don't think all workloads belong in the cloud. Some do, some don't. And in the same way that you and I kind of, we were talking earlier about how we cut our teeth and we moved into virtualization. It was about decreasing the footprint of the data center, right? Essentially, that's what virtualization was trying to, or did, for the data center before we got into the whole, application stack of it, right? Right now, at that point, we were just looking at reducing the footprint. So that's kind of like some key strategies that are still happening today, right? People are moving to the cloud for a reduction of data center, or they want to get out of the data center business. They want to get out of the hardware business. And I think a good portion of our clients that we work with are actually looking to do that, right? They just want to, power cooling, square feet just to them just does not work in their business model today. And we're seeing that all over the place. So, you and I had a conversation in an earlier podcast where it was looking at workloads, right? And essentially, that's what we're dealing with. Back in the day was reducing the size of your footprint inside of the data center. Today, we look at workloads. How do my applications live inside of cloud? Can they be cloud native? Do I move them to cloud native? Are they monolithic today? So my apps, essentially, which are my workloads, and it's technically, the blood of the business. So what do we do with those workloads and how do we move them around and what's the best fit? That's the question today. And, going back to what you said earlier, not all workloads belong in the cloud, but, definitely understanding what they do and how do you move them should be part of your strategy.
Christian, you have touched on a number of topics that I've had entire podcasts around, from being cloud or cloud native to multi-cloud, and does it really exist? I'm going to tell you right now, I don't believe all workloads belong in the cloud, and there's a number of reasons for that. I believe a majority of workloads will, but most companies will have a hybrid type model if they're a traditional enterprise or just an enterprise company in general. There are those cloud first companies are born in the cloud, which is another topic we can jump on and talk about. But I believe if you look at the current companies, do you know that there's statistics around it that there's only 3% of workloads have been migrated to the cloud?
No. Wow. Okay.
3%. So just think about that. I mean, it's huge because there are so many of the workloads that are still on premise. That's where the hybrid comes in there. And that's where you have to analyze every aspect of it and does it go to the cloud. Now, just talking about in AWS terms, they've created new types of services and models, AWS landing zone, edge computing, to kind of tackle some of these that can't migrate fully to the cloud. Or they've come up with their storage gateways that allowed you to enable the hybrid type methodology. Let's talk about an application just trying to get to the cloud. You get contacted by a customer and there's like, hey, Christian, we want to move to the cloud. Do you all right, let's do it? Or how do you approach that?
Easy peasy. We got a button for it, right? I think everybody thinks that, right? We got a button for that. We can just move it.
Wait, let me get the easy button now. I think I got one of those. Done.
It can be done, right? No. So there's a lot of moving pieces when it comes to an application. That really you have to really look at the development of it, right? How is it built? How is it, designed in other words, to work with services like AWS provides, right? So you're either taking an application and just lifting that same workload and moving it into a VM like you run today inside of your own data center, or do you consume some of the services that AWS provides, right? So you can leverage a lot of the either automation or cost optimizations by using those services. And then how does that change your development cycle, or how does that change your application, right? So you have to, we talk about things like cloud native today, and those are services, right, that integrate with your applications where you can leverage some cost optimization as well as automation. Or are you still running like a single monolithic application that you run on a single VM today that maybe has access to a backend database? And then do you move that to AWS, right? So now you think, well, how do I get my cost optimization, in AWS? Or do I look at other cloud strategies? Am I just moving my VM, or is it the whole application? So these are kind of the questions that I kind of have with our clients, where, okay, you got an app, it's your driver for the business, at least one of them, right? Because typically there's multiple applications that you're working with. And is it something that's off the shelf? Do you have a development team? What are you doing in terms of development? How is it performing today? What's your expectations by moving to the cloud? And what are you looking to gain from moving to the cloud? Is it because you want to consume those services, or do you just, again, you and I had, again, going to go back to this conversation that you and I had, just to kind of bring it back a little bit, is what's driving you to the cloud? Forget the application, forget the workload. Your initiative starts off by either I want to get out of the data center, or I have an application that I want to do X with, right? And that's kind of the, how I see the two drivers of companies today building a cloud strategy around those two. And there may be some other, where it's just a blanket, hey, we got to move to the cloud because we saw Gartner saying this, right? And there really is no strategy. But ultimately, if we go back to the application that you had presented, again, you have to take a look at your application. How is it performing today, and what's the outcome that you're expecting? Because ultimately that'll drive which cloud model is best for you, because not one cloud fits all, right? You could be running some backend Microsoft applications inside of Azure, and you may have an application that's consuming some of AWS, and then you might have some on-prem storage or workloads, because you need to have that within your own data center for some type of compliance, right? So now you're kind of spread out all over the place.
Christian, I see analyzing the application as a key component moving forward, because you have to understand, and I like that you jump in there and ask specific questions. Hey, I want to move to the cloud. Well, I'm going to tell you no right now, and until I understand the way that you want to do it and why you want to do it. Because you might have an actual physical application. You have a dedicated server on your on-premises running this, and everything might be monolithic, just house it in that one box. It might be beneficial just to go to a virtual on-center, right, to your vSphere, whatever cluster you want to do. Or you might want to then take that and move it to the cloud. But you have to also understand, if you take that monolithic application, it's got the database, it's got the messaging, everything is done. Do you even want to break this up? Is it worthwhile to break this up into just key microservices? And then those microservices, can you get some benefit on using like AWS's services, those managed services already for that? There might be no benefit. In fact, it might be just worthwhile to do a lift and shift to move over there. Or you might be saying, listen, just go virtual and stay in-house, because the communication and the latency to all the other applications is not worthwhile. And that actually poses another kind of concern, is does that application talk to other applications and work together? Right. And if you move that one, now you've got a latency issue between all of it. So I don't think it's a quick, yeah, let's just do this. I think you have to analyze all the applications, even if it's just one application trying to move.
And that's totally true, right? With anything that you're doing towards cloud, you have to look inward first, right? You have to look at the foundation of what you're running today for every workload, right? It could be application that you're building, or it could just be off the shelf applications that you've consumed, that you've paid for licensing and is running part of the business. If that's part of your strategy to move everything, then you really need to look internally now, because like you had mentioned, your application is going to be tied to a lot of things. And you need to understand whether that application moves, and then how does the connectivity, whether it's something that's on-prem or somewhere else out in the cloud, or maybe it's a SaaS-based service that you're pulling information from, how are they going to talk? And then, so looking at that inwardly, meaning my performance, my connectivity, like all these have to you have to clean everything up, right? You don't want to build some on a foundation that's already broken. So if you have termites in your foundation, you want to build a second addition to it. So you need to understand your total foundation as a whole, and then make decisions in smaller steps if you do have a cloud strategy, whether that's just, hey, let's take this one application, understand how it's connected, understand how it's performing, fix it on-prem first, and then move it out to the cloud, because then you'll have a metric that you can base your success on when you're moving to the cloud. Because again, your strategy is about understanding what you have, how do I get there, and then ultimately, am I successful by moving this out to the cloud? So how do you kind of line up against success if you are running an underperforming application? You're not going to be able to gauge that out in whatever cloud service that you're looking at. So definitely there's a lot of internal work that has to happen. It's not just an easy button like I'd mentioned earlier, right? It's there's a lot of work that needs to happen internally, and that's kind of like a transformation, internally, in your own on-prem infrastructure and how you manage things and how things are performing. So definitely you have to look at those things before making a decision, not only on what cloud, but how you're going to get there, and then ultimately, how do I measure success?
Christian, I think some of the decision comes into the application as you're analyzing it is, do I refactor this into cloud rather than move it into cloud? Do I retain it where it's at because it's going to be end of life soon, or do I retire it, or is it just going to be available, kind of locally in the data center? I think some of those things are key components to it. Now, what about companies that are coming in there, like CTOs are coming in saying, we have all this stuff in the data center, but we're doing a cloud first strategy? I mean, really, is it going, any new applications is going to the cloud? Are we building in the cloud and not realizing what we have back on premise? And now are we causing double work? Or are we looking for applications that we can host as a SaaS within our own cloud?
Right. Yeah. And so that goes back to what I said. So as the example you presented, you have some C-level person tell you we got a cloud first strategy. Well, that's great, right? There's nothing wrong with somebody telling you that, but at the same time, there's questions that need to be asked, and there's that analysis that I mentioned earlier. It's like, okay, we can kind of lead with that. We need to understand why, like what's our driver, right? And if it's because ultimately when somebody from that level says, hey, we need to be cloud first, to me, it's like, hey, I want to get out of the data center business, right? Because it's not specific to an application, but that's where you start asking, okay, well, we have these applications that can benefit from some cloud, but you got to work slowly at it. You can't move it, you're not like all in. Now there is, and one of these things that I think gets left out of this conversation, I'm going to be honest, is whenever we're talking cloud, we're always thinking the hyperscalers. So we're always thinking AWS, Azure, Google. And so there are VMware-based clouds. So if I had somebody at a C-level say to me, hey, we have a cloud-first strategy and it needs to be done by the end of the year, I'm like, okay, I need to find a VMware-based cloud where I'm consuming it on a per-month basis, or obviously contracted, but it gives me a level of service that I'm looking for in cloud and I'm getting out of the data center. That's the perfect, you can take your VMs and, which most likely going to be on VMware, and this is specific to VMware. Obviously, there are still those running on Hyper-V, or maybe you're running like KVM or something. But still, if you're VMware based, a good portion are. I would say that you can look for a VMware based cloud service that would give you the same benefits that AWS would, right? And there's some management around that needs to be tied in, and some thought process on how you're going to get there, but still, it's still a valid, cloud solution. And I don't want to kind of, leave that out of the mix, because I've worked with clients that had that initiative where we just want to get out of the data center. Like, this data center is going down, or we want to get out of this colo, or my hardware is up. Like, this is the end of life on my hardware. Do I buy hardware, or do I just consume it as a service from a VMware-based cloud provider? So at that point, you could just take your VMs and move them, right? And you're back up in business, you're running. At the same time, though, you had mentioned earlier refactoring your applications. If that's part of it, now you're saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to take this application, refactor it. Now, what's the best cloud, right? Maybe that VMware-based cloud isn't the best solution for that. Maybe AWS and consuming some of those services are. So again, that inward analysis really becomes key to answer a lot of the questions that should be asked to whoever's asking you that.
Now for a quick interruption. A huge shout out to our friends at Veeam for sponsoring this episode. Veeam Backup for AWS can easily protect all of your Amazon EC2, RDS, and VPC data. Wait a second, they can protect my VPC data too? Yep, that's right. Simplify AWS backup and recovery while ensuring security and compliance. All right, now back to our episode. So Christian, we were talking before about managed services and having IIS installed on these servers with like 200 plus websites. And I'm talking about like IIS 5. And I'll tell you what, yeah, I am that old. But going back, then we have VMware, which is basically virtualization. And everybody called it a private cloud at that time. So cloud adoption is not something new. Now we have public cloud. Isn't just going to a cloud first strategy still private or public cloud and maybe a hybrid type approach?
Yeah, it definitely is. I'll call it hybrid, right? Because a lot of these either hyperscalers, obviously, you're running, you don't have anything private, meaning that you don't have hardware dedicated to you, although you could if you wanted to, right? And I think everybody kind of provides a solution like that, including a VMware-based cloud. You can either get your own private cloud, which is just resources dedicated to you, or you're living in some type of multi-tenancy where you're consuming resources with other companies as well, right? So it's kind of a hybrid strategy from a hardware perspective. It's still, to me, it's still a cloud first strategy, meaning that whether you're moving your VMs to a VMware-based cloud or you're kind of forklifting all your applications, whether it's refactoring or replatforming, and putting them in a hyperscaler, you're still consuming it, because at the end of the day, it's not yours, it's not your hardware, you're just consuming it as a service, right? And everything we're doing now is moving to as a service. And so, to answer your question, yeah, I think it's still part of the cloud first strategy at the end of the day, right? You get a monthly pay. I pay for Hulu every month, right? I real neat story. I just cut TV cable last month because there's so many services that I can consume on a monthly basis, and then when they don't have anything good, I could drop it, right? And then I could re-sign up again if something good is happening within that platform. And that's kind of how we consume cloud today, or we should be consuming it, because at the end of the day, it's about cost optimization. I cut cable because of cost optimization. But you run your workloads like that as well. They shouldn't be running all the time. And if they do need to be running all the time, that's where I say, then you should just move your VM, as opposed to just, if you're going to move your applications to AWS, a lot of those cost optimizations are about how long this thing's running, right? So if you have an application that you're replatforming, or, whatever you're doing with it is, should it be up all the time? Should I be consuming these resources all the time? And the answer is no, you shouldn't be, because if you want cost optimization, it'll keep you from having to say, hey, we tried moving to the cloud and it was a lot more money than we thought it was, right? And I get a lot of that, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of that, right? People are trying to run back and buy hardware again, and you're like, hey, wait a minute, like, how did you do it? How did you do it the first time? Like, what happened, and how did you base that metric? Because again, going back to what I said earlier, analyzing your current infrastructure, making sure that you have a metric to be able to, like a standard, or so to say, right? Everything's running performant. Our resource utilization is great. This is what we should be getting from our cloud provider. And then ultimately that would be your metric.
Real quick, Hulu is not an official sponsor, but if you'd like to, comment down below. Feel free to have you on there.
I didn't think of that.
That's all right. You don't have to think of that. I'll get on there. Thanks for the shout out, because I do the same thing actually with my Hulu subscription. Football season is live after everywhere else. I don't mind watching things a day later if I ever get to it. Okay, Christian, your role at Aspire is very unique because it says data center cloud solutions architect, because usually there's one or the other, which helps you understand both aspects of the data center and going to the cloud. The reason I mention that is specifically around skill sets, because understanding what is required not only in your data center and going to cloud to move to it will really drive some of the changes in the application migration or cloud first strategy. Now, here's my question for you, because cost is huge, and we're talking about that right now. The reason that cost is huge is because people don't have the proper skills to do it and to move it over. They're not understanding their metrics in moving it over. They're not understanding what's all it entails to move this application over to it. But your role at Aspire helps you understand both, not your background of on-premise data center, because I know your expertise in that, and I know your expertise in cloud, and having this role at Aspire actually drives you to help these customers a lot more and be more efficient.
Yeah, it does. It's crazy because I remember being post sales, or at least in the sysadmin role. I've always had a view from one side, right? We were the engineers in the back, and back then, and things were coming in, and you would look at a design, because back in those days, pre-sales was kind of just starting, right? We just had sales guys that were selling monthly subscriptions to organizations that were looking to run websites. But ultimately, we had to support them as well as do the server configuration and all that went with that. So I got to see one side of it. So when things would come in, and I would say, "Wow, like why did they do it this way? You could have done it better. X, Y, and Z. Why are you doing it this way?" And at that point, you were already, it was already purchased, so it's not like something you could go back. So I had this understanding that, the front of the house was like, these guys, what are they doing up there? How are they architecting? How are they figuring this stuff out? Not enough resources. Did you get this? Did you get that and the other thing? And then the cool thing happened where they're like, hey, do you want to go into pre-sales? Now fast forward, obviously we're in cloud. We had our own cloud nodes that were running VMware-based clouds. And so I'm like, yeah, let me give it a shot. And it was an eye-opener to be able to straddle now what was on the back end and what was being, complained about on the back end, which now I felt like, hey, I have access to correct. So that was an eye opener for me, right? To be able to straddle both, I guess, worlds in this case, right? Many people said to me that I went to the dark side because I went to a sales type role. Even though it was an engineering, type role up front, I was moved to the dark side, but it was giving me that point of a site where I could see what happens on the front end, how sales needs to happen, but ultimately being able to bridge the front of the house to the back of the house, right? And that kind of holds true in my role today as data center cloud, because they're kind of competing, if you think about it, right? The on-prem is looking to move the cloud, and then you have server vendors. The big guys want to keep selling servers, whether it's to an organization like a client of ours, or whether it's to the larger cloud providers who are consuming servers like crazy, right, to build their cloud nodes out. So I kind of straddle that data center cloud conversation where I can now gauge. It's like, hey, I've done a lot of data center before, and a lot of this makes sense to keep on-prem. Or, hey, to me, this cloud option is a much better option for you because you can consume it as a service and you may save some dollars there. Everyone's talking about this. It's hard to get hardware nowadays because of supply chain issues. So a lot of people have strategies like, hey, like we can't get servers, but I guess what? I can consume some cloud, right? They have a ton of that. So being able to visualize both sides of the house, is kind of why I wanted to make that not dual role, but be able to have in my title that, hey, I can talk to on-prem and I can talk to cloud, and maybe there's a mixture of both, and maybe that's part of your strategy. But ultimately, my job is to make sure that what you're doing or your strategy, lines up with what the business wants and the outcomes they're expecting, and ultimately help you analyze, what stays on-prem, what goes to cloud. And that's really just like through assessments, having conversations, and making sure what makes sense for the business. Is it cloud or is it on-prem? And then how do we get there?
Christian, I believe you indicated that companies are going to the cloud and then they start to move back sometimes. Not all companies, right? And they're like, oh my God, it's not what we expected. I think there are two reasons, okay? And these two reasons sit side by side. There's not number one and number two. They are number one and number one. The number one reason is skills. They migrate to the cloud thinking they know and understand all the things and the aspects to it. And when they start getting there, that one person leaves and they're not actually educating those on premise and investing in their workers training and to make sure that their skills are there for all these cloud services. Because AWS alone has 210 plus services and reInvent's right around the corner. So I'm assuming that's going to get to like 225 or
more announcements.
Yeah. So that's really coming our way. Actually, stay tuned, everybody. Got a huge event happening at reInvent, podcasting, live streaming, the whole entire works. You're going to catch a lot of Myer Media and Go-to-Market Delta. Stay tuned for more information on that. The other number one reason is cost. They moved to the cloud because it gets too expensive because they don't have the training and understanding what it takes to shut down servers. They're spinning up things like crazy. And just in like your data center, you have your CapEx cost and it's spread over like a 5-year term. But in a cloud, you are literally paying for what you use and you can't predict it as well as you can within the data center. My server is going to run the entire time. So Christian, what are your feelings on my two number ones? Not only the skills and then the costs associated with going to a cloud first strategy. Now, I'm not saying everybody's moving back, but what I'm saying is that they move to the cloud thinking, oh, it's the next thing. We got to go there. We got to jump there, but not understanding the whole idea behind it. Christian, how are you helping companies with not only the skills and the cost? Is Aspire doing something like that?
Well, yeah, definitely. The skill set is pretty huge, right? I think you're right. The skill sets need to be there to be able to understand a lot of these services are being provided. Specifically, you'd mentioned like AWS, which has a plethora of services that you can consume. At the same time, so do the other hyperscalers. So yeah, a skill set to me is something that we definitely help out with. And understanding what is necessary for you to be successful in a hyperscaler. At the same time, cost optimization is huge. Cost optimization is probably one of the key things to me that would want a company to stay in the cloud, right? I'd mentioned where we could, there are cloud companies that are still consuming their AWS bills and they're just chewing on it like the dinner that you ordered at the diner but don't want to send back, and you're just going to consume it, right? I've been there, man. It's like, you order something at a diner and you just like, hey, I'm just going to muster through this and I'm going to eat it. It's not the greatest thing
I'm going to stop somewhere else on the way home and grab something. No, I'm just kidding.
Exactly, right? Or whatever it is. But there are organizations that are chewing on their billing every month, feeling it, but they don't want to actually do anything about it. They're just like, hey, this is the cost of doing cloud, right? Hey, we're here. Right? So
check that box off. Okay, I checked that off. Hey, how do we look?
Exactly. So it's, so they're consuming that. But at the same time, there are those that are trying to come back, and we're kind of like in between the, hey, we want to come back, or hey, we have an on-prem and we want to go. So we're kind of met in the middle. It's like, hey, you're coming back, why? Or hey, you want to go to the cloud, why? And so that why really is the driver. And most of the times it's like, hey, we're coming back because of cost. We didn't know it was going to be this much. So I'm like, okay, well, why didn't you know it was going to be that much? And you start kind of like peeling at that. And it's like, well, they said we had to be in the cloud. So we kind of just moved everything. It's like, so you just picked everything up and just picked the t-shirt size VM and dropped it on top of it. And you're like, yeah, like I had a client's like, hey, my database was like 36 gigs of RAM. It's, it's like on my VM. And it's like, so I had to find something similar to that in AWS. I'm like, whoa, it's like, nah, that's not what you want to do, because obviously that's going to be expensive, especially if it's running all the time. So, those conversations are definitely being had with us, and we're definitely helpful in that area around cost optimization. But at the end of the day, the cost optimization is start the cost optimization in-house first, right? Understand your workloads and resources, which then ultimately you can translate that into what you're going to be paying into a hyperscaler. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of other hidden fees that you can't calculate in a hyperscaler, right? And typically that's around bandwidth. But still, there, you can get close and kind of be like, hey, depending on your utilization, we can kind of capture that what you're doing on-prem and maybe get you close to what you're doing inside of a hyperscaler. But then this is where I say that what's the best fit for you in a cloud? Because you can get a VMware-based cloud that has all the bandwidth already built in, and you don't have, you just pick your VM up and move it into a VMware-based cloud. And in that type of situation, you have a fixed cost that is not going to scale like you would with the hyperscaler. So again, understanding what you want to do to get to cloud, what's the driver, and ultimately what's the best solution when we talk about quote unquote cloud, is really where we help companies, their selection process is really what it comes down to.
Christian, you touched on, I want to say, cost optimization, and AWS Cost is one of my areas of focus. I've actually been involved in it for the last couple of years. It's been one of the things where I start to drive towards in a knowledge, and I'm creating a whole series on AWS Cost Savings Quick Tips, where I created a new AWS account. I have 0 installed into it, and I'm walking folks through some of the things to set up for success in this AWS account. I like how you're a detective. I think we should change your title, like Data Center Cloud Detective Solutions Architect. We could make it an acronym like DDCSA or something like that. Hopefully that doesn't stand for anything else. But I like how you're a detective. What's that?
Should be a certification.
Yeah, I'm sure. Actually, a data center cloud solutions architect, that should be a certification. I think having the background that you have in data center makes you perfect for cloud. I think the stuff that I did, starting out has been key to my cloud success. I understand everything that comes into it. I understand the components of not only a server, but in the networking aspect, where I would ask you a bunch of questions from there. And when we would try to figure it out and be like, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know I could do that. And learning how to troubleshoot was key to success and all that. I think that makes you ideal for this role and to help customers go to cloud, but also understanding why they should go to cloud.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we try to drive, right, is not that, hey, we're good at getting you to cloud, right? Hey, we can do that. We can get you to the cloud. But I think the deep dives inside of what you're doing today inside your organization and how things are leveraged, I think is honestly the key driving factor for you to be successful in any cloud, right? And I think the discovery process internally, we talk about digital transformation, right? And that's really just the process of how you're going to do business and be profitable, and how do we get the most out of what you have, and how do you bring the resources that you have and have them ultimately all, like, everything needs to work for you. Like every piece of resource or every VM, every CPU needs to make money somehow, right? Or drive some type of, bottom line for the business. And that cost optimization, whether it's through resources or through processes, really is going to be key in your digital transformation. So if you want to do digital transformation, you start on-prem, right? You start with in-house, get it to a place where you're performant, how your applications run, have an understanding, and then build metrics from that. And then ultimately your cloud strategy is going to be successful as you're on-prem, because if you understand how things work and you can mimic that in cloud, again, obviously it's going to be different. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it's going to, be the same, but ultimately you can, now build metrics around that. Because again, you need to gauge what is successful in the cloud. And if you were looking for cost optimization, you better have cost optimization, right? Or if you're looking for automation, you want to automate, some applications or workloads, or you want to consume some of the services inside of AWS. Again, you better have metrics around that, because ultimately you need to gauge success. Now, you had mentioned way earlier, there are organizations like startups that are building in the cloud today. Cloud native applications are being built today. Now, obviously, they're building their metric, right? And then ultimately you need to kind of drive it lower, meaning if I build an application that's cloud native, I'm paying this much per month, now, and it's running at this performant level. I need to get better, right? So your driver, you have got, teams that are, their drivers is to drive down cost, the cost of your application, because you have no metric to gauge against. But if you have an on-prem data center, you can build those metrics to gauge against. And I think that's where you're going to see yourself be successful. Am I successful by moving my workloads to the clouds? And here's how we can do that.
Christian, I'd love to have you back for another episode to talk about some of the things you're doing with specifics around a customer and how you approach everything from step by step, including costs and how you're visualizing stuff. My last question before we wrap things up. We don't want to talk about digital transformation on this show just yet. We said multi-cloud, cloud versus cloud native, with digital transformation. I've had so many topics on all of these subjects, but going off of digital transformation, and should all workloads really kind of migrate to the cloud? How important is it to have the key stakeholders in the room during these conversations with regards to either the application or this cloud first strategy?
Oh, wow. I mean, they have to be your champion, right? It has to be the champion. Leadership has to be the champion to be able to get this done, because if there are multiple teams that you need to engage, and they need to get on board, right? Because a lot of times we have, we've run across them. We have teams or members of teams that are very, stuck in their ways. Some of them be like, nope, cloud is not the way to go. And, they're stuck. And maybe it's fear of losing out on your job, right? There's always that thought, like, if we move to cloud, what am I going to do? Well, there's a lot for you to do, right? We just need to, it's just going to be in a different area. It's going to be, it's no longer in a data center. You can't touch it anymore. You can't. And so one of those things, there are people like that. But at the end of the day, if you have leadership that's driving this, right? And obviously the communication between the teams has to be key. But ultimately, leadership has to be the champion that's moving you to a cloud first strategy, and most of them are, right. It's very, very low amount of organizations have somebody driving it from the middle, and then it becomes pretty hard from that point, because again, there's no leadership that's actually leadership might be like, hey, yeah, take a look at that or move in that direction. But there is no real driver from their perspective, and that's where we kind of come in, right? It's like, hey, we're in the middle tier here. Maybe it's a manager for infrastructure, right? But you still have an application, and there's still a development team manager that you need to get through. So the conversation is like, hey, this is great that you're going this route, but who are your stakeholders in the organization? And we should bring them all into the room, right? Yeah. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to either pay the bottom line or make money or lose money in this. And so we have that conversation with those, and we build champions out of those leadership teams to be able to champion the fact that, hey, everything trickles down, obviously, right? So you can get the application management in line. You can get your infrastructure in line, and anybody who has a stake in whatever's being moved would then kind of say, okay, leadership wants this done, we're going to move forward. And you don't get that pushback then, right? Because sometimes it gets really political, and it can get ugly. So yeah, leadership is key in moving to the cloud.
Having all the stakeholders in the room at the same time, having everybody kind of either a bottom-up, top-down approach. Now, I'm okay with a bottom-up approach, meaning your engineers and your practitioners are driving some of the change due to the needs of the application. But if you don't have all the key stakeholders like the top really kind of saying, yes, this is what we're doing, and not one of those, well, yeah, why don't you take a look at that? That means no matter what I come up with, your decision is we're not going. I need a solid decision and commitment that, yes, we want to go to cloud, and you are the driving factor around it. Christian, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I mean, on my 100th episode, no less. Christian, this has been awesome.
Yeah, this was great. Hey, I really appreciate that. It was a surprise to me. I mean, goodness gracious, when you said that, I was like, what? I feel like I won the lottery. John Myer Media, 100th episode, and I got to be the guest. I appreciate that, John. Thanks for all you do, man. And I like I said, congratulations on what you're doing. It's amazing. I love to see your growth. I've been a fan for quite some time. I think back when you were you and I started kind of reconnecting back when you were actually teaching some AWS or some Cisco training as well.
Yep.
We had some great conversations back then. So where you came from, awesome, man. Congrats.
Thank you so much. It means a lot to me. It means a lot that you're following and, obviously advocating for me out there. Everybody, Christian Chavez, data center cloud solutions architect. We might have to actually split or change your title, but maybe in the future. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks a lot, John. Appreciate it.
All right. This has been the John Myer podcast. Don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, and notify because guess what, folks? We're out of here.